The next week was the ugliest and most clarifying week of my life. I stopped acting like a son. I started acting like a witness. Then an inventor. Then, eventually, a threat. I hired an attorney my mother hated by reputation. She specialized in founder disputes, IP chain of title warfare, and corporate fraud cases where the people in charge had spent too long assuming no one around them understood the machinery. When she finished reading the key documents, she looked up and said, "If this is accurate, they didn't just fire you. They closed the deal standing on a trapdoor." Her team moved fast. Preservation notices. Inventorship review. Quiet contact with transaction counsel. Preparation for emergency relief if the sale attempted to finalize post-closing transfers involving disputed assets. Parallel evaluation of whether internal scientific disclosures had been materially incomplete. We did not bluff. We built. And while we built, the world kept praising my parents. Business media called the acquisition historic. Analysts called it strategic genius. There were photographs of my mother in white, smiling beside the acquiring company's CEO. There were headlines about family legacy, scientific courage, and market-changing innovation. My father gave a quote about taking bold science to the world. I read those stories like a man reading his own obituary written by the people who poisoned him. Then, 3 business days before the celebratory closing gala, everything cracked. The buyer's outside counsel received our formal notice. Not public. Not theatrical. Surgical. It identified a disputed ownership chain over essential platform components, raised unresolved inventorship and assignment concerns, and requested immediate suspension of closing mechanics involving the affected IP until the record could be verified. The notice also flagged questions around internal scientific risk disclosures that might become relevant depending on what diligence materials had been shared. I wasn't in the room when they opened it. But I know what happened next because by 11:18 a.m. my mother called me for the first time since the firing. I let it ring twice before answering. She did not say hello. "What do you think you're doing?" No warmth. No softness. Not even performance. Just fury. I said, "Protecting what I built." "You are jeopardizing a transformative transaction." "You mean I'm interfering with the part where you sell something you may not own?" The silence on the line was brief but satisfying. Then she lowered her voice into that deadly calm I had known since childhood. "If you continue this, you will regret it for the rest of your life." I said, "That makes 2 of us." She hung up. My father called 13 minutes later, already in damage control mode. "We can work this out. There have been misunderstandings. Don't let lawyers inflame this. You know how complicated these structures are. Think long-term. Think about family." Family. Funny word to hear from a man who had watched security escort his son out of the building he helped create. I told him if he wanted to talk family, he could start by telling the truth to the buyer, the board, and the employees. He said, "This doesn't need to become public." That was when I understood their real fear. Not losing me. Exposure. In businesses built on mythology, truth is never just a legal threat. It is reputational acid. It gets on everything. Past interviews. Past promises. Past fundraising. Past philanthropic posturing. If one lie comes loose, people start pulling at all the others. The buyer paused the closing process immediately. Not publicly, of course. Publicly, everything remained on track. Internally, panic spread like electricity. More document requests. More legal review. Sudden emergency calls. Questions about execution history. Questions about inventor attestation. Questions about diligence boundaries. Questions no one asks unless they are imagining the inside of a courtroom. I started hearing from people I hadn't spoken to in months. Former employees. Current employees using burner numbers. A regulatory consultant who said, "I thought you should know they scrubbed certain language from the safety overview before the last diligence room opened." A finance manager who sent me screenshots showing unusual retention bonus structures contingent on closing silence. A clinical operations lead who wrote, "I can't do this anymore," and attached internal comments that contradicted summary representations given to outsiders. That's what happens when power slips. Conscience, suddenly, becomes affordable. The thing about abusive systems is that most people inside them are not monsters. They're frightened. They compromise 1 inch at a time because every inch is survivable. 1 email left unanswered. 1 phrase softened. 1 risk deferred. 1 polished slide. 1 private doubt swallowed. Then one day the structure shakes, and all those people realize the floor under them was never solid either. They started talking. Not all at once. Enough. Enough to make the buyer nervous. Enough to make the board divided. Enough to make my parents stop acting invincible. The board scheduled an emergency in-person meeting and demanded my attendance through council. I almost declined. Not out of fear. Out of disgust. I had already said the truth when it cost me everything. Now that the sale was wobbling, suddenly my voice mattered again. But my attorney told me something important. "Go," she said. "Let them hear the version of you they tried to replace." So I went. I walked into the same glass tower where security had marched me out 9 days earlier. Different room this time. Larger. Colder. Everyone overdressed for a war they hoped would still look like governance from the outside. My mother was at the far end of the table, immaculate as always. My father looked older than he had the week before. The buyer had counsel present. So did the board. So did I. Nobody smiled. The board chair opened by referring to recently surfaced concerns. Recently surfaced. As if I hadn't been surfacing them for over a year. Then they asked me to explain. And for the first time in my life, I answered without trying to protect anyone in my family. I walked them through the platform development sequence. The entity transfer gap. The missing inventor confirmation. The annex language. The integration of disputed framework elements into the company's later core stack. Then I walked them through the scientific concerns. The subgroup inconsistencies. The internal debates. The softened safety language. The distinction between uncertainty and fraud, and how aggressively the company had blurred that line in pursuit of valuation and timing. I was careful. Precise. Cold. No drama. That's the mistake my parents made. They thought if I ever came for them, I would come as a son. Emotional. Furious. Easy to dismiss. Instead, I came as the person who knew the work better than anyone in the room. When I finished, the buyer's lead counsel asked my mother whether she had been aware of the assignment irregularity. She said the company believed it had comprehensive ownership. Believed. A beautiful lawyer word. Soft enough to survive. Weak enough to hide inside. Then he asked whether the unresolved internal scientific concerns had been fully reflected in the diligence materials. My father started answering before counsel cut him off. That was the moment I knew they were losing control. Because my father never shut up unless someone stronger in the room forced him to. The meeting lasted 6 hours. By the end of it, 3 things were true. The buyer would not close on original terms. The board could no longer pretend my termination was unrelated. And my parents had finally discovered the cost of building a company around fear. When the center breaks, almost nobody falls trying to save you. The next 48 hours were a bloodbath behind closed doors. The buyer threatened to reduce valuation dramatically unless all ownership issues were cured, all disclosure concerns remediated, and certain executives were removed from post-closing authority. The board launched a special committee review. My termination for cause became legally dangerous for them because it now looked retaliatory. My mother tried to marshal loyalists. My father tried charm, outrage, nostalgia, and wounded founder theatrics in rotating sequence. None of it worked. Reality had arrived with documents. I wish I could tell you some noble part of me felt sad for them. It didn't. Not then. Maybe not ever. What I felt was a strange, clean grief. Not for the parents sitting across those tables. For the parents I had spent my life inventing. The ones I kept hoping still existed underneath ambition. The ones who would finally choose truth once the stakes got high enough. They never did. Even then, even cornered, even staring at collapse, their instinct was not confession. It was containment. My mother sent me a private settlement proposal through counsel before dawn on the third day. Massive cash. Restored equity treatment. Mutual non-disparagement. Inventor recognition language. A future advisory title. All the elegant pieces wealthy people slide across tables when they want silence to look like healing. I read it twice. Then I told my attorney to reject it. She asked if I was sure. I said, if I sign that, they still win. They just pay for the version of me that shuts up. By then, employees had started sensing something was wrong despite the internal blackout. Celebratory emails stopped. Integration calendars went fuzzy. Senior people vanished into conference rooms. Rumors spread across Slack channels and private group texts. People asked whether layoffs were coming, whether the sale was failing, whether the science was under attack, whether I had done something terrible, whether my parents had. That last question mattered. Because once people ask whether power lied, the spell weakens. A week after my firing, the board announced my termination was under review pending independent findings. 24 hours later, the buyer formally amended the deal structure. The headline valuation dropped. Escrow obligations increased. Executive continuity terms changed. Enhanced representation and indemnity provisions were inserted. Translation: the company was now more expensive to trust. My father was removed from all closing-related communications. My mother fought harder. Of course she did. She had always been the true engine of control. But even she could see the perimeter shrinking. The board demanded she step aside during the special review. She refused. They threatened removal. She called it disloyalty. That word again. In families like mine, loyalty means agreeing to disappear when required. The special committee interviewed more than 30 people. They found enough. Not enough for the kind of dramatic television ending where federal agents kick down doors and everybody goes to prison by lunch. Real life is rarely that cinematic. Powerful people buy complexity the way other people buy insurance. But there was enough. Enough to establish that I had raised legitimate concerns in good faith. Enough to show my termination process was tainted. Enough to indicate certain diligence disclosures were, at minimum, aggressively incomplete. Enough to force resignations. My father resigned first, citing health and the emotional burden of transition. He always did prefer exits that let him perform injury instead of accountability. My mother lasted 6 more days. 6 furious, scorched earth days where she tried to salvage allies, reshape minutes, contest findings, and position herself as the only adult left capable of preserving value. When the board finally voted to remove her from executive authority, she sent a 7-page letter about betrayal, ingratitude, institutional cowardice, and the tragedy of visionaries punished for moving too fast. There was not one sentence in that letter about patience. Not one. That told me everything. The public statement, when it came, was a masterclass in corporate burial language. Leadership transition. Governance realignment. Revised transaction terms. Ongoing confidence in the platform. Appreciation for founder contributions. Commitment to compliance and scientific integrity. People outside the company called it a bump. Inside the company, it felt like an exorcism performed by lawyers. And me? I got reinstated first in an interim scientific oversight role, then formally restored as founder and inventor with expanded authority during the review period. Not because the board suddenly loved me. Because they needed credibility, and credibility was the one thing my parents had spent years trying to drain from me and accidentally concentrated instead. Employees started stopping me in hallways again. Some apologized. Some cried. Some acted like nothing had happened, which honestly was more insulting than the apologies. One young researcher hugged me so hard I could barely breathe and said, "I thought they were going to bury this forever." That sentence stayed with me. Because that was the real victory. Not that I got my seat back. That the truth didn't stay buried. You might think this is the part where I tell you I took back the company and finally became the leader I was always meant to be. That would make a cleaner story. It just wouldn't be true. What happened next was harder than revenge. I had to decide whether I still wanted the thing I had nearly died building. That question sounds simple until the people who betrayed you attached themselves to your dream so completely that separating the two feels like tearing skin from bone. For weeks I walked through Varelia like a man touring a house after a fire. The labs were still there. The teams were still there. The programs still mattered. Patients still mattered. But everywhere I looked, I saw old ghosts. My father taking credit at a podium. My mother rewriting language in a redlined memo. My own younger self explaining away the warning signs because admitting the truth would have shattered my entire idea of family. People kept asking what I wanted. Control. Restitution. A public apology. A bigger title. A new board. A new deal. I wanted something simpler and harder. I wanted to stop bleeding from a wound nobody could see. It turned out revenge doesn't close wounds. It exposes them. Yes, I had stopped the clean theft. Yes, I had forced the truth into the room. Yes, my parents lost the version of victory they had planned. But none of that gave me back the years I spent begging love from people who only knew how to reward usefulness. None of that turned my childhood into something softer. None of that changed the fact that on some level, some humiliating, stubborn level, part of me still wanted them to call and say, "We were wrong. We see what we did. We are sorry." They never did. My father sent one message months later, "I hope one day you understand the burden we carried." My mother sent nothing. Silence was her final strategy. If she couldn't control the ending, she would deny me the closure. So I built my own. 3 months after the board upheaval, I declined the permanent CEO track they offered me. That shocked people more than the scandal. But I knew something they didn't. The company could survive without me at the center. I could not survive if I chained my entire future to a building filled with the architecture of my own betrayal. I stayed long enough to stabilize the science, fix the governance exposures I could fix, protect the teams that had been bullied into quiet, and restructure the programs around actual transparency instead of valuation theater. I pushed for independent data review, stronger patient risk disclosure, inventor accountability, and board changes that would make a family coup much harder in the future. Then I left. Not in disgrace. Not in exile. On my own terms. I spun out the disputed optimization framework into a new entity under a settlement the revised board eventually accepted because, by then, everyone understood the alternative was years of litigation neither side truly wanted. I took a small team. Careful people. Honest people. The kind who ask ugly questions early. The kind who don't confuse charisma with competence. We started over in a smaller space with worse coffee, fewer photographers, and infinitely less theater. And for the first time in my life, I built without needing anyone's permission. That was the real revenge. Not destroying my parents. Outgrowing them. People always imagine revenge as a moment. A trap springing. A speech landing. A face collapsing in shock. Those moments exist, and yes, they can feel incredible. There is a kind of grim electricity in watching the people who humiliated you realize they no longer control the story. But revenge, if it means anything lasting, is structural. It is refusing to carry their version of you into your future. It is learning that being discarded by the wrong people can save your life. It is realizing that sometimes the worst day of your life is not a collapse. It is a separation. The day they fired me, I thought I had lost everything. My identity. My work. My inheritance. My family. What I actually lost was an illusion so expensive it had nearly cost me my soul. The illusion that I had to earn love by being indispensable. The illusion that genius excuses cruelty. The illusion that family means loyalty without truth. The illusion that if I worked hard enough, suffered quietly enough, delivered brilliantly enough, the people who raised me would eventually become the people I needed them to be. That never happened. And because it never happened, I was finally free. There is one more thing you should know. About 6 months after the sale was restructured and my parents were gone, I was invited to speak privately with a small group of patient advocates whose lives had been touched by our early research. I almost declined because by then I had learned to distrust rooms filled with gratitude. Gratitude had too often been used to trap me in obligations I never chose. But I went. An older woman there took my hand and said, "I heard some version of what happened. I don't know the business details. I just wanted to thank whoever insisted the truth mattered before this went any further." I couldn't answer right away. Because for so long the battle had felt personal. Family. Ownership. Betrayal. Credit. Erasure. Revenge. And in that moment I remembered what had made me fight in the first place. Not pride. Not money. Fear. Fear of what happens when people with power stop seeing human lives and start seeing narrative risk. That was the part of my parents' world I refused to inherit. They taught me ambition. I won't deny that. They taught me stamina. They taught me how institutions work, how donors think, how power dresses itself in moral language. Those lessons were real. But the most valuable lesson they ever gave me came by accident, and they gave it to me the day they thought they had one. They taught me exactly what I would become if I ever built anything without a conscience. So I didn't. Sometimes people still ask if I hate them. That's not the right word anymore. Hatred keeps a room reserved in your mind for the people who hurt you. It keeps them central. It keeps your pulse tied to their shadow. I refuse that. What I feel now is colder and cleaner. I understand them. That may be worse. I understand my father's hunger to be admired because without admiration he had to face the emptiness underneath performance. I understand my mother's obsession with control because control was the only way she knew to keep terror from surfacing. Terror of losing status. Terror of losing relevance. Terror of being ordinary after building a life around exceptionalism. I understand all of it. And because I understand it, I no longer need to stand close to it. Their punishment was not me exposing them. That was only the trigger. Their real punishment was that the world they built required endless maintenance of lies, and once truth entered, even briefly, they could never fully reconstruct the old illusion. People remember. Boards remember. Investors remember. Employees definitely remember. And underneath every future introduction, every future invitation, every future attempt to re-enter the world as misunderstood pioneers instead of compromised operators, there will always be a whisper. Weren't they the ones who tried to sell the company and throw their own son under the bus? Weren't they the ones who almost got away with it? Almost. That word matters. Because almost is the difference between the life they planned for me and the life I chose. They almost erased me. They almost sold the most important work of my life without telling the truth. They almost turned me into a cautionary tale about gifted people who couldn't adapt. They almost made everyone believe I was unstable, ungrateful, impossible, dangerous. They almost won. And if I had still been the version of myself they spent years training, the obedient son, the exhausted builder, the brilliant little machine desperate for approval, they would have. That's the part one think about most. Not how close they came to victory. How precisely they failed. They failed because they built their empire around one bad assumption, that I needed them more than I needed the truth. For most of my life, they were right. Then one day they weren't. That's all it takes. One day when your fear gets smaller than your clarity. One day when humiliation turns into evidence. One day when grief becomes instruction. One day when the person they thought they raised finally introduces themselves to the person they actually created. That version of me walked into the boardroom after being publicly humiliated, professionally stripped, and personally betrayed, and did the one thing my parents never believed I could do. He stopped asking to be chosen. He chose himself. If you've never lived inside a family business, you may think the money is the point. It isn't. Money is just the amplifier. The real war is always about authorship. Who gets to tell the story? Who gets to define sacrifice? Who gets to claim the dream, the labor, the genius, the pain? Who gets framed as the visionary and who gets framed as the difficult one? Who becomes legacy and who becomes collateral? My parents spent years writing me out of the story while standing on my work. What they didn't understand is that the truth has authors too. Lab notebooks are authors. Drafts are authors. Timestamps are authors. Warnings are authors. Silence broken at the right time is an author. And in the end, the story they sold was weaker than the story the evidence could tell. So yes, they sold our $2 billion biotech company. Yes, they fired me. Yes, for a brief, sickening moment, they thought they had finally done it. They thought they had taken the platform, the money, the reputation, the ending, and left me with a cardboard box and a dead badge. But what they really did was force me into the only position from which I could ever become dangerous to them. Outside their control. Outside their narrative. Outside the family script. That's where the truth was waiting. That's where my name still meant something. That's where everything they tried to bury started breathing again. And that is why the day my parents thought they'd won was the first day they began to lose. Because a lie can hold a company together for years. A lie can decorate magazine covers. A lie can raise money, charm boards, impress donors, and silence weaker people. But once the person who knows where the lie lives stops protecting it, the countdown starts. I was that person. I had always been that person. I just didn't know it yet. Now I do. And if I ever build something great again, and I will, it will not be great because it is large, expensive, admired, or feared. It will be great because nobody inside it will have to bleed in silence to keep the story clean. No child will have to earn dignity there. No scientist will have to soften the truth to preserve evaluation. No employee will have to confuse loyalty with self-erasure. No patient will be treated like a variable in a branding campaign. That is the company I should have built the first time. Maybe pain is a brutal teacher. But it teaches. And the final irony, the one my parents would hate most, is that losing them made me more honest, more disciplined, and more dangerous than inheriting them ever could have. So when people ask me what happened, I don't say my parents sold the company. I don't say they fired me. I don't even start with the boardroom or the legal notices or the patents or the acquisition collapse. I say this. The people who raised me confused ownership with love, and one day they pushed that confusion too far. After that, everything else was just paperwork.